This motor is just so pretty, I feel obligated to shine this light over the top of it just to get it to reflect and shine and glimmer so you can see just how gorgeous it is. Now it looks pretty gold in the video, but it's really not that gold. It's more of a whitish gold. It's a very fresh looking gold color, if I had to explain it in some sort of descriptive word. But this is the Xing Cyber motor, and very much looks like the Cyber truck, because that's sort of somewhat how it was based off of, I think. Or maybe they had it in production and then they saw the Cyber truck and they decided to call it the Cyber motor because it's sort of just somewhat reminiscent of that car. Anyways, so this motor's most likely its main claim to fame, and what you're really getting it for is going to be the looks, because it is just so pretty. It's definitely a fantastic motor on the inside as well, but let's be real, it's just so pretty. You're getting it because it's an art piece more than an actual motor on the inside. But again, that being said, this is a very, very well built motor, and from what I can tell on the inside, it's very, very similar, if not the same, as the previous Xing motors, the premium line, not the E-series budget line. But first, let's take a closer look at the casing and the general exterior of the motor before going on inside. So the motor has a unibell external construction, and this is a technique that's been done for quite some time now, where the bell is kind of a separate piece, and the whole motor, the magnet ring and everything kind of slips into the bell, and so it looks like it's just one unit. And that's really nice and gives you this really, really nice clean finished look, and it's how they're able to get all these diamond cuts on it and make it look the way it does. So that's super cool. With this long wire, which I didn't measure it, but I think it's about 130 millimeters, it comes in at about 34 grams, actually 38.9 grams. That's without the prop nut. And you can see on the top, it's got nice knurling on the top of the bell to really grip the prop, not allow it to slip. That's very important to have. And when you look on the underside, it also has a lip for the magnets so that they don't slip. And something you may have noticed is this giant gaping hole on the inside, because this motor actually uses a full-blown M3 screw to retain the bell, which is, again, something that is becoming more and more common across many motors, but it's really nice to see, because this is a very robust screw, and it's a screw that if you lose, you're probably going to have a couple of lying around that you could use as replacements. And something else you probably noticed is that the bearing on this motor is very, very special. And it's special because this is a 2306 size motor, and I'll talk about that size in the 1999 KB and other things in a bit as well. But when you look at that bearing, it looks giant because it's genuinely giant. It is a 10 millimeter bearing, and so I'll hold this up to it. It's 10 millimeters. It's a 10 millimeter bearing. So a little bit about the bearings. Not originally, but way back when mini quads and FPV flying was becoming more and more popular, bearings were 8 millimeters. They were 8 millimeters, and the shafts were 3 millimeters. They weren't even hardened steel shafts. Hardened steel shafts in 3 millimeters diameter are very strong. They really don't break. What was that company? ZMX? ZMX was one of the first companies that I personally used motors from that had a hardened steel 3 millimeter shaft, and those held up really, really well. But everybody wanted to move towards a 4 millimeter shaft because there was such a bad taste in everyone's mouth with those 3 millimeter shafts, because they would bend so easily when you hit the top of the bell. When you hit the edge of the prop, it would just bend the shaft, and it was just, the motor was essentially done, and you had trouble pulling it out, and you couldn't really replace the bearings, replace anything, because everything was just destroyed. And so when they moved to 4 millimeter shafts, the bearing actually stayed the same originally. The bearings continued to be only 8 millimeters in maximum diameter, and so there was a 4 millimeter inner diameter, 8 millimeter outer diameter. That means, and then there was metal of the bearing itself. That means the actual balls inside the bearing were so tiny, they were just like scratching around the edge of the metal. So we moved to 9 millimeter bearings, And that was a huge help, not only in the durability of the motor, because now your balls inside the bearings are a lot bigger, and so they can kind of take more forces and they're kind of performing better overall, but also because the motor just tended to be a lot more smooth. And this concept of smoothness, wave the light over it so it's more interesting. This concept of smoothness is really, really hard to convey, because how do you convey a motor being smooth? How do you convey a prop being smooth? How do you discuss smoothness? What is smoothness? And the best way I can explain it in this motor is that if you feel a knob or a switch on a very low-end car, it feels kind of plain and it has no weight to it. But if you feel a knob or a switch on a BMW or a higher-end car, it kind of has a quality feel to it. It has this like weighty motion to it. Or similarly, a mouse, a computer mouse. Sometimes a mouse that weighs too little feels really cheap and just doesn't really have this same kind of satisfaction of moving the mouse around, whereas a mouse that, well, many people prefer lighter mice, specifically for gaming and such, but I'm just saying the feel of the mouse. When you have a mouse that weighs heavier, it kind of has a more weighty quality feel to it. Same thing with a phone when it's cheap. Whenever something is like cheap and fickle, it feels lighter, or sorry, when it's light and fickle feeling, it feels cheaper. And when it's like more robust feeling, it just feels more quality. And so having a larger bearing in your motor just feels like it's more quality. It feels like you have this weight to the throttle that just feels more correct. And obviously this is an analogy. It's not a direct explanation of what you're actually going to feel with the motor. But the reason I'm focusing so much on the shaft of the motor is because this is what I believe the primary advantage to this motor, and the primary benefit is the fact that it has a 10 millimeter motor in a motor that is of this size and is about 38.9 grams without the top screw on top and the long wire, which is actually a pretty good weight for this kind of a motor, with the unibody bell and all the bells and whistles and everything built into it, everything that it has on it. I mean, bigger bearings weigh more, so it's harder to get the weight down when you have all that bearing, and you also need to kind of redesign the entire stator to take that larger bearing. So now I'm going to take the motor apart, and you'll see something else on the inside, which is what I already discussed, is the bearing is giant. And specifically, look at the rim around the bearing. It's hard for me to point out. I didn't bring any pointing utensils, but look at the gold rim around the bearing, this thin rim of metal, because that is the base of the actual motor, and that's what your stator is actually connected to. That's what's holding the stator in place. And so another issue that happened was that when they did move to the larger 9mm bearings, they didn't actually redesign the stator to compensate. And so this thin ring of aluminum just got thinner and thinner and thinner, and then people were cracking their stator off the base of the motor because the aluminum was just too thin. And so they did have to actually redesign the stator to get it to actually fit this 10mm bearing because of the engineering challenges. And just to try and convey the actual engineering that has to go into this motor, they then need to re-engineer the entire poles of the stator. They need to re-engineer how the wires are wrapped. They need to re-engineer kind of everything about the motor to get it to do what they want it to do. And having wraps that are doubled over these poles is actually not quite as favorable as having just one row of wraps all the way down the pole, because your wraps are getting farther away from the actual pole, and so your magneticity or flux through the pole is becoming a little bit weaker as this wrapping goes further out. Now, I just explained all this stuff. I don't actually know if they re-engineered and redesigned this thing. They could have just made this thing thinner and just put a bigger bearing in there. I just wanted to explain to you the engineering that should go into it. And I don't have any of the previous higher end Xing motors available for me to compare this to, but based on all the motors that I've seen, I would say that this rim around this bearing looks about average, maybe a little bit thinner than average, but about average. The metal in this motor is 7075 aluminum, so it's going to hold up probably pretty darn well no matter what it is. And the bearing is fantastically smooth. It just feels so nice and luxurious. Something else about the base that I forgot to point out is that it does have this little rim over here which holds your wires down, so that means once you mount it flat to your arm, it doesn't ride up and actually scrape the edge of the bell. So now looking at the bell itself, look inside and you'll see, ooh, that came off actually. Okay, well, that's good. So you see the green ring around the bell. This is something that I first saw in the Xing motor, the original higher quality Xing motor, and I was very impressed to see it because that little rubber band, while they call it a bearing saver, I actually don't think it does very much in the way of trying to save bearings, but I do think it does a whole lot in your ability to tighten the bell. So before people started using this rubber O-ring, you had a screw retained shaft, screw retained with these screws on the bottom of the bell. But if you tighten that screw too much, then you would bind the bell onto the bearing and the whole bell wouldn't spin anymore. So now that they have this rubber O-ring, you can actually go ahead and tighten the screw 100% and it's not going to bind it. It's going to still spin freely because of that rubber O-ring. It's pulling up the slack, keeping everything taut and in place. The magnets on this motor are supposed to be very, very strong magnets of the strongest order that we have available to us. Very hard to confirm that, but hey, they feel pretty strong in the hand. The magnets are curved as well, and as I also explained, they have this lip so that the magnets don't slip. Way, way back when, and still today actually, many motors that don't have this lip under the magnet ring tend to slip magnets occasionally from time to time. Not all motors, but other hobby motors have tended to be particularly good about that. Now, just to round everything out, I'll talk about the rest of the motor, but honestly, a lot of this stuff, I'll explain what I mean about it in a minute. So, to round out the rest of it, it has 0.15 millimeter laminations. It has single winding winds around each stator pole. Jury is still out on which one is better, multi-stranded windings or single-stranded windings. Single-stranded has tended to hold up to heat better, or not heat, but yeah, heat. Basically just heat build up in the motor. It can take higher temperatures. The enamel on this motor, I think it's like 260 degrees Celsius, whatever it is, that also plays into the durability of the motor. How much is it going to be able to hold up to the punishment of bad filters or ESCs that aren't properly functioning, or really thrashing it in turtle mode or something. All this stuff is the highest it could possibly be in this motor. Now, one thing I wanted to point out, which may or may not be the case, I actually don't know if it is. I haven't talked to them specifically about it. But the shaft on this motor, to me, it looks like steel. It could very well be titanium. I think it might be titanium just because the motor's weight is a little bit lower than I would have expected it to be. At 34 grams with this long wire, it's probably titanium, but I'm really just guessing here. Steel is going to be stronger. Hardened steel will be stronger, especially with the hollow shaft all the way through. But titanium is a lighter metal, and ultimately it doesn't really matter which one is in the motor. It only matters with respect to the actual weight of the motor. Titanium costs a lot more, but it's a little bit lighter, but it is also brittle and it's also weaker. I kind of just ran through a kind of summary of many parts of a motor. The wires coming off it are also 20 gauge wire. It's 20 gauge wiring. Some motors actually have 18 gauge wiring coming off of it because they say that it's got like a 2% increase in performance because of the conductivity of the wires. So this is kind of generally what you should consider looking at when you look at a motor. However, and this is a really big however, and I immediately apologize to iFlight and any other motor manufacturer out there, because I have tried so many motors over the years, and it is exceptionally difficult for me to tell the difference between a number of these things that I pointed out. Now, this motor that you're looking at has been built to the highest spec of quality that iFlight can actually produce, and they actually produce pretty darn good motors as well. I mean, the Xing line of motors are really great motors, and the E-Series motor is my top recommendation still to this date because it encompasses most of the features that I personally look for in a motor. The downside being only that the metal, the aluminum in it, is actually 65, whatever. It's the slightly weaker metal, and that does translate into a motor that's not quite as durable as a motor that is made of the higher end metal. But it also saves a lot of money. This is a $23+ motor, and the E-Series is a, I think, $15 or $16 motor. So you're going to get sort of what you pay for. However, like I said, there's a number of things that are really hard to decipher or distinguish between if you are to fly two quads side by side with everything being the same except for this one thing being changed. And a while ago, I actually spoke to the Lumineer engineers about this because they were sending us motors and I was testing them and I'm like, well, the magnets don't feel strong. Well, the construction doesn't feel right. Well, the laminations don't feel thick. By the way, the laminations are these striations that you see in the actual stator. And having thinner laminations is more beneficial because it reduces eddy currents. Eddy currents are things that kind of build up in the stator poles, which detract from the flux or magnetism going through the stator pole. So it's a bad thing. You want it to be as small as possible. The thinner your laminations are, the less eddy currents you're going to have in the stator pole, and that's good because it increases the strength of the magnetic flux going through the whole stator pole. I'm not an engineer, by the way, in this area. I don't do any of this stuff. I'm just talking about things that I've learned over the years and kind of off the top of my head. If I'm saying things incorrectly, please do correct me in the description below because a lot of my knowledge has come from you guys helping me learn a lot of this stuff. And so I'm really just scraping the surface of all these things. The windings have the skin effect, and arguably the multi-strands will have a higher surface area because of the area of the actual wire is less on the inside. You have more external surface area, so you have a better conductivity through multi-stranded wires. Single-stranded wires tend to have a better high temperature performance. However, that has a lot to do with enamel wrapping around the windings, not so much the actual copper itself in the windings. But again, I keep talking about all this stuff, but I'm trying to get at this one thing. So the Lumineer engineers actually told me that people can't tell the difference between 0.2 and 0.15 millimeter laminations, and they can't tell the difference between strong magnets and just not as strong magnets. Originally, I was kind of appalled to hear that, but then I tested more and more over the years, and yeah, I would totally agree with them. That doesn't mean I want weak magnets and square magnets and thicker laminations, because it does ultimately make a efficiency difference, and the motor does actually perform a little bit different when you kind of put all that stuff together. And really the discriminating factor here is going to be the cost of the motor. How much are people actually willing to pay for a motor that has XYZ features? And so a number of the features that are in these super duper high-end, super high quality motors, which are all fantastic and we all want, some of them cost a lot to do, like the titanium shaft. The actual cost of the titanium shaft is very high, so it increases the cost of the motor considerably. Having thinner laminations is very expensive, so we haven't gone to 0.1 millimeter laminations because it just costs too much to do that. Having windings that are very, very high quality with very high temperature enamel that are wound to perfection costs a lot to do. And how much does this stuff actually improve the motor? Now, again, I'm just touching on the surface of this stuff because there's a lot of other things that go into the engineering of mini quad motors. Believe it or not, there actually is a lot that goes into it. But how much of it actually matters? And that's what I'm trying to get to. I'm trying to really ease into saying that I honestly cannot tell the difference between a $16 motor and a $30 motor today in this market right now. If you put this motor side by side with a $16 motor, I will actually be able to tell a difference because of the 10 millimeter bearing. You can definitely tell a distinct difference when you have a larger bearing in the motor. But if you have the same bearing, then it's really hard to tell the difference. Sure, things might perform a little differently and you might have just like a couple seconds more or less flight time, but in general, over 50 flights, it's going to be pretty hard to tell the difference between a good $16 motor, because there are a lot of really bad ones, but a couple of them are really fantastic, like this $16 or $15 or $16 Xing E-Series motor from iFlight, which I think is a fantastic motor. The trouble is durability with that motor. A higher end motor has the higher end aluminum, has the higher end everything, and it will hold up a little bit better. Again, that being said, if you're going to hammer your quad into a concrete wall, ain't nothing going to hold up to that. So does it really matter? Might as well go for a lower cost motor that's going to cost you less to replace when you have to replace it, not if you have to replace it. So now this is where I have actually started working on my motor. I actually went through all the features and all the differences between all the little different aspects of the motor, and I kind of tried to put all the quality things that matter into the motor that I'm designing. And I'm not saying this is bad or other motors, but there's no way I'm saying anything like that. I'm just putting together a motor that I personally think is actually made to be the best value I can find. And so this motor, I would say, is fantastic, but you're getting it for the bling, 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 bling of that diamond bell, because it's gorgeous, but just be aware of what you're getting. You're getting the best possible motor that's on the market. I literally have not seen a motor that's better built than this, and they're all the top-end motors are built really well now, but this is among the very best motors out there. And so for all this quality and all this everything, you're going to pay a price, and this motor comes at quite a premium. Now there is one other motor that I'm going to be testing next on this quad, and that's the motor, that's the other high-end motor from Amax-Ino, which also makes fantastic motors, and now they have a very high-quality line as well. So my general review of this motor is that it's fantastic. It performs great. Now, the KV and the size of the motor discussion, I'll kind of touch on that quickly. I kind of talked a lot about the internals of the motor, but the KV of the motor that I have is 1999 KV, and I think that's a little bit high for 6S. I think this is more of a 4S, 5S motor, even though a 4S is a little bit low. I prefer more like 1800 kV, and yes, it actually does make a difference, especially with 6S. You got all those volts, it multiplies across those 24, 23, 22 volts, and so it does actually make a difference. The 1777 kV seems a bit low. It seems like a low number, and I would say that this particular motor is probably more like 2200 or 2100 kV, because I was already flying it on a 10% throttle cut, and actually dropped my throttle cut down to 20%, like 20% off the top, and it was still really powerful. And I love power, everybody loves power, but it also makes it really difficult to fly. So having a motor that's really overpowered makes it really hard to pull out of dives, really hard to be touchy and smooth and gentle when you're coming down, trying to go under a tree, dive and duck under things. So I would recommend probably the 1777 kV. I haven't tried it, but if you're running 6S, that's probably a better option for you. And the 1999 kV is probably going to be a fantastic option for 5S. I don't have any 5S batteries, but based on this performance of this motor and how much I cut the throttle down, the 1999 kV is going to be great for 5S and very good on 4S as well. Now, my personal opinion is that I don't think anybody should be building any quads that are 4S only. I don't think 220-something 100 and above kV for a 5-inch quad should be built anymore. I think that running a lower kV motor that's intended for 6S that has a little bit more kV on it, because we prefer a little bit more kV usually, is probably going to be a better option than running a high kV motor that's specifically intended for 4S only, because it really does limit you. While 4S is still totally fine, there are quite a few advantages to be gained from moving up to 6S, and the primary advantage is voltage stability. You just feel no sag. It feels more like the throttle feels like a simulator. Like there's no difference in the throttle throughout the entire life of the battery, and you're actually stressing your batteries a lot less because you're not pulling the amps out of them as hardcore. And so they still get hot, still get burnt, still get used, but it's just a little bit different. And it also gives you more carrying capacity. So while lighter 5-inch quads tend to feel much nicer in the air, when you have a lot of power, it does kind of make up for a lot of the difference. And so it's having a little bit extra kV on a motor that will run well on 4S, because if you have an 1800 kV motor, it'll run well on 4S, but it'll just run exceptionally well on 6S. And I'm a very big fan of throttle cuts as well. At least 10% comes off every single one of my motors across every single quad, because it just tends to feel like the quad has better control. My best guess about that is that the flight controller will have more headroom to make adjustments, because even when you're near full throttle, it still has some extra RPM to burn. So it has a little bit extra performance to kind of pull itself out of sketchy situations. So I prefer having a little bit more kV, giving it a throttle cut for 6S, and then dropping all that throttle cut and going down to 4S when I want really exquisite throttle control, when I need to have really smooth motions and do really, really smooth things. Also, for beginners, running a 6S quad on 4S is so much easier to fly. I don't know why any beginner or intermediate, for that matter, would even bother with running a 4S quad on 2500 kV on a system that they touch the throttle and the thing goes off to the moon. Power isn't everything. Okay, I've talked on forever. Now, the flight performance difference with this motor, I mean, it's great. You're going to need a throttle cut if you have 1999 kV. The performance is great. The 9mm bearing is the 10mm bearing is definitely doing its work here, and it's actually making a difference here. Now, the folding props are fantastic on this motor. I love the folding props more and more every day that I use them. I only have 2 sets of these folding props, and I spent 1 set chopping up a tree. They still work, but I spent 1 set chopping up a tree and running into poles and things. And I actually ran into a pole with this quad by accident, like a real life crash running into something. So I'll show you that. And I actually prefer the folding props at this point over the Gemfan 51433. They're about even. The overall control, performance, and everything on the 51433 is a touch better, but these folding props are just so darn convenient to travel with. It's hard for me to take them off the quad because I don't have to fiddle with anything. I just throw the quad in my bag, throw the quad in the car, and I move along. These props are coming to FPV Cycle. Dal tells us that we'll have them in 2 weeks. I think it's going to be more like 3 to 4 weeks because of the pandemic and the slow shipping of everything right now. And that's about it for now. This is enough time spent talking about, honestly, not this motor, but this motor in general. It's a beautiful motor. If you want it, go for it. Don't forget to floss your teeth. Very important. Take care. Bye.